All right, welcome to the final session of the Ethics and Culture Conference this weekend. It's wonderful to have all of you here. We're going to do this last session in the language of the saints, Gaelic. San Clemente's two Millenia, the living church uncovered by excavation and discovery. And to give our keynote, we're honored to have from the Emerald Isle Father Paul Lawler, who is a member of the Order of Preachers. And Father Paul Lawler is an Irish priest and archaeologist who's one of the foremost living experts on the Basilica of San Clemente in Rome. How many people have been there? Not too many. Having participated in its excavations, Father Lawler's work contributed to the discovery of the 6th century sacristy and baptistry of the lower basilica, whatever those are. Which profoundly reshaped scholarly understanding of early Christian liturgy and church architecture. Today, as rector, he oversees an ambitious program of restoration and conservation that continues to reveal the basilica's layered history, from the ancient Roman domus and mithraeum to the medieval frescoes. Father Paul is a native of Tralee, Ireland. How many people have been there? Okay, good. And a graduate of the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology in Rome. Previously, Father Lawler taught Christian archaeology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. I've never heard of it. He also collaborated on archaeological missions with the École biblique et archéologique français de Jérusalem, and spent several years serving as pastor of the English-speaking parish in Tehran, Iran. Please welcome Father Paul Lawler.
Hello, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I hope you understand my Irish brogue. I'm told I have a brogue. I never knew that before. I thought I spoke good English. However, you're very welcome. We're going to speak about one of the most fascinating and beautiful churches in the world, San Clemente. Right beside, as you can see from this print from 1800, the Colosseum. On the Via San Giovanni in Laterano, the street between the Colosseum and St. John Lateran's. As I say, it's a fascinating church, and if we're talking about the living tradition, here we have the life of the Christian community going back over the centuries. And it's extraordinary because it's a place where you can go down and visit the various buildings. Yes, I taught Christian archaeology in the Angelicum. I began in 1985, the year there was a famous student now called Pope Leo XIV. But he wasn't my student. He was studying canon law at the time in the Angelicum. So I hope I didn't push him in the corridor or something like that. As I say, San Clemente is something which is so beautiful. It captured me as soon as I arrived in Rome in 1976, when I was studying Islamics and Arabic, of all things. And I met and worked with Federico Guidobaldi, who's probably the leading Christian archaeologist in Rome, and became his apprentice before setting out for Iran. But then, of course, along came Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution, and I was thrown out of Iran for the first time. And I came back, and they sent me to do Christian archaeology in the Pontifical Institute. And it was a golden period because we had at the time Professor Andrea Ferrua, the man who excavated the tomb of St. Peter. We had Umberto Fassola, the great expert on the Jewish catacombs. We had Pasquale Testini, the man who wrote the manual of Christian archaeology. A great, as I say, golden era of Christian archaeology. And I was just blessed to be part of that world and to learn something about it. The Basilica is obviously one of the most beautiful. And when people come into the church, you can immediately hear the gasp as they see this wonder before them. And there are two reactions. People either bless themselves or take out their cell phone to take a photograph. They're the two reactions as they come into the Basilica. The Basilica was considered up to 1857 to be one of the oldest churches in the world. And we follow always the practice of those going back to Giovanni Battista de Rossi. In order to understand a church, you have to look at the sources. The method also, of course, of Richard Krautheimer who always listed the sources at the beginning of the corpus of Basilicarum, the great corpus of basilicas of Rome. And here we have got a number. First of all, the famous one is called the Dominicum Clementis. It no longer exists. We don't know what happened to it, but it's recorded in the corpus of Latin inscriptions. And it says, the full text says, "Take hold of me. I am a runaway slave of Victor, an acolyte of the Dominicum Clementis." It's always put down as a slave collar, but we're not sure because it doesn't exist. It might have been for a dog or for a donkey. We just don't know. But we have the inscription, which was dated by De Rossi to the 4th century. Nowadays, people are inclined to date it towards the end of the 4th century. So that's the first source, the Dominicum Clementis. Next is the famous one of St. Jerome. Oh, sorry, in the States you say Jerome. I have to get my accent right. St. Jerome wrote a book called De Viris Illustribus, on important men. And at the end of the chapter on Pope St. Clement, who was, of course, the third pope after St. Peter, Peter Linus Cletus Clement, there's an addition which says, "And a church, ecclesia, a church in Rome preserves the name and memory of Pope St. Clement up to our own time, usque hodie." And St. Jerome left Rome about 385. So, and it's already an old church. You remember the first churches were built in 313 under Constantine. So we consider the church to be pretty old, going back to one of the oldest of the churches. The next inscription is very interesting, 384, 349, the inscription of Siricius. Well, this is something new, that because Guido Baldi in his doctoral thesis way back in 1976 and repeated afterwards, said that this was a reconstruction made by De Rossi, which wasn't valid. He said the letters were different sizes, different widths between the letters, that it was a false reconstruction. He has now, in a publication printed last year, taken back his words, and he believes that it is an authentic inscription. The difference in measurements is caused by the fact that there were very likely 2 dedication inscriptions. It's there as you go down to the lower church. So we've got, according to Guido Baldi, a dedication inscription of the church towards the end of the 4th century. The next mention is Pope Zosimus held a council of the church to condemn Pelagianism. Some people say Pelagius was Irish. We were condemned already in 417. There's a mention of a council of the church held in the Basilica of San Clemente. And then next, whom we recently celebrated, Pope Leo the Great, speaks about the Titulus Clementis, that is the parish church of San Clemente. So there we are, within 100 years, 4 descriptions of the church. First of all, as a Dominicum, the meeting place on a Sunday. Next, Ecclesia, St. Jerome, and then a Basilica, and then a Titulus. So we have all these references to the early church. And the church we see today was considered to be the ancient church of San Clemente, named after Pope St. Clement. However, in 1857, a Dominican by the name of Joseph Meluli said it's not possible. And this is the key to understanding San Clemente. We're in a valley between 2 hills, between the Caelian Hill and part of the Esquiline Hill, the Colliopio. And in valleys, the ground level tends to rise. Buildings are knocked down, they don't take away the rubble, they use the old walls as foundations for the new structures, and we get one layer on top of the other. Very often the old walls are used for the new building, and the new building is built at a higher level, but within the same walls, which is the case of San Clemente. So I don't like the name that people, I hear tour guides saying, it's the Lasagna Church, as if it was layer and top of layer. It's one. The walls actually of the upper church date back to the 4th century. So but we have the rise in level over the ages. So what we've got discovered in 1857 by Father Joseph Meluli is the lower church was discovered. How did he come to discover it? He says himself in his book, after a careful study of the marbles of the choir and an examination of the topography of the region, I came to the conclusion that the present church is not the church mentioned by St. Jerome. In fact, we've discovered just last summer that the Comune, or the municipality of Rome, built what we call an intercapadine. That is a trench underneath the sidewalk, you say it, or pavement, sidewalk, underneath the sidewalk running along San Clemente. And it must have been, the walls of the lower church must have been visible in 1857. Because it's in that period that Milluli begins his excavation and discovers the lower church of San Clemente. The lower church, which is so powerful because it's got one of the finest collections of medieval art in the world. This extraordinary place, the Basilica of San Clemente, the lower basilica. And going down deeper again, he discovered another layer which goes back to the 1st century, where we've got two buildings, a domus and a horia, or warehouse. Going down deeper again, actually, he came to the water table. But we can see the walls of Temple of Claudius, the time of Claudius, about the year 40, destroyed in the Great Fire, more likely the Great Fire of 64, the fire of Nero, the result of which Peter and Paul were executed. So we've the water poured into the excavations after Father Milluli and flooded all the lower level. However, in 1914, Cardinal O'Connell of Boston became the cardinal titular of the church, and he built a tunnel at a lower level to take the water away from underneath our church, down the Via Labicana, around the Colosseum, and into the Franciscan church. No, not into... beside the Franciscan church of Cosmas and Damian, an old Roman drain. So you've got, this water is flowing today happily down and bringing the dampness to the Franciscans. But we can, before this was done, we talk about students would swim down the staircase with a candle in their mouth going from room to room, but those were the days when men were men. And that's the story. I don't know how true it is. What is we've got at the lowest level, as you can see, I just point out the fact that you can descend down the stairs into these different levels, which is so exciting and a wonderful experience of the history of the church, going back centuries, and also the history of the city of Rome, going back to the imperial period and going up through the Middle Ages, up to the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So these are the steps built by Milluli back in 1860. So you've got the lowest level of buildings. You've got the upper part on the diagram here, you've got the domus. It's actually a cryptoportico, which is a slightly underground level, which was used very often in the summer period, where you've got an nymphaeum or a summer triclinium dining area and several other areas. And it's separated by a narrow corridor, and the other building is about twice the length of the church, going down, made up of a whole series of cell-like rooms leading onto a central courtyard. So a domus, and underneath an industrial building of some sort, most likely a horia, which is a warehouse. Now, the building on the top, the domus, you can see here the different periods. Up here, you've got the architectural style, which is familiar from Pompeii, whatever. We've dated this building to about the year 90 from the brick stamps. And here at this level, the plaster is torn away and they put in this other building, which is related to the Mitraeum. An interesting paper has come out in the periodical Archaeologia Classica of the Sapienza, University of Rome, published last week. So there we are, up to date. And it's written by Robert Coates Stevens, who was the archaeologist of the British School at Rome. And he's made an extraordinary proposal that this house that we see here, the domus, was the house of Titus Flavius Clemens. It seems so incredible, because way back in 1880, Joseph Lightfoot, the man who wrote on the Apostolic Fathers, many of you would have read his work on the Apostolic Fathers, made the same proposal, because De Rossi, when this building was discovered, because of the tradition that it was somehow the house of St. Clement, thought it was the house of Clement the Pope. But Clement the Pope was obviously a Jew, a freedman, because he had a Roman name, Clemens, and he would never have had a house in the heart of imperial Rome. It was just impossible. So Joseph Lightfoot put forward the proposal that it was the house of Titus Flavius Clemens, and the Pope Clement could have been a freedman of that household. Titus Flavius Clemens was related to the Emperor Domitian. He was a consul. He was executed about the year 95. His niece was Domitilla, who was exiled to the island of Ponza because she was a Christian. And afterwards, how do we get to Titus Flavius Clemens? Because a study of the regional catalogues of the 4th century indicates that the house was owned by a man called Brutius Presens, a fascinating character, worthy of Hollywood. He was a friend of Pliny the Younger. He was an officer in his 20s and put down a rebellion in Germany, a rebellion of the legions. He waited because the legionaries in Germany had allied themselves with the German tribes, and they were ready to come over and march on Rome. Brutius Presens waited till the Rhine melted and came in and put down the rebellion. The tribes couldn't come across the Rhine. And so he was rewarded for his bravery and putting down the rebellion. And he was given, according to later evidence, this house of Titus Flavius Clemens. Afterwards, Brutius Presens retires and goes down to Basilicata, and there he writes a history of the world, no less. They were ambitious people. A history of the world, which doesn't survive, but is quoted by Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote a history of the church precisely on the life of Titus Flavius Clemens and Domitilla. Afterwards, we find that also the land on the Via Ardiatina, which belonged to Brutius Presens, or originally to the Flavian family, was given to Brutius Presens. Then in the 4th century, when this was suppressed, we find that the land over the house becomes the Church of St. Clement, and the land on the Via Ardiatina becomes the Catacomb of Domitilla, a saint which existed centuries beforehand, going back to the 1st century. 3 centuries had passed, and it's curious that they go back to the memory of Domitilla. And he has found lots of evidence of the memory of Domitilla in the Church of San Clemente. As I say, this is a proposal put forward last week in the most recent copy of the publication of the Archaeologia Classica, a very exciting theory which would bring Christianity to San Clemente in the 1st century. And then in Venosa, which is the capital, one of the cities of Basilicata, they found an inscription of Mithras, which dates to exactly the same period when this house in San Clemente becomes a Mitraeum. Arches are opened. These capitals date to about the year 200. And in the center of the triclinium, as we'll see, here is just a reference for anybody interested to the Archaeologia Classica, this work of Robert Coates Stevens, who was the archaeologist of the British School at Rome, which has put forward this very interesting theory of bringing Christianity back to the 1st century. As I say, he points out that the family became followers of Mithras about the year 200, exactly when San Clemente becomes a Mitraic center. And we have this wonderful Mitraeum, which was originally a triclinium or a dining area of the house, and is now converted into the center of the Mitraic cult, the mystery cult. Cumont, what's his name? Franz Cumont was the great expert on Mitraism. And I was delighted to find during the summer in the archives many letters of Franz Cumont, who gave the explanation, the classical sort of explanation of what Mitraeum is all about, that it was a cult which came from Persia. However, in the 1970s, this theory was overthrown and is now seen as a Roman religion, probably related to astronomy. And that's a whole other world. It becomes one of the great religions from Jura Europos in Syria right across to Hadrian's Wall in the north of England. Curious thing, some of the Mitraeums are found under churches. Why is that? Well, some people suggest that the followers of Mithras, such as this painting in the Scuola Mitraica, were close to Christianity. Their values were courage, strength, authenticity, etc. However, they were doomed to failure because they wouldn't allow women into the cult. So there was no hope for them. But however, strangely enough, within the Scuola Matraica, we do find the painting of a woman from about the year 200. So maybe when this is restored, and there are several other traces of the Matraic cult within the Scuola Matraica, and one of our hopes is to make this more accessible in the near future. The other building, which I mentioned, is this labyrinth of rooms. And this is an industrial building. There's no sign of painted plaster. There's no sign of marble. It's some sort of an industrial building. Philip Quarelli, who wrote the Archaeological Guide to Rome, believes this, he identifies this building with the mint, where the coins were minted at the second half of the 1st century and dedicated under Trajan. It was originally up on the Capitol Hill, the Campidoglio, beside the temple of Junia Moneta. Junia, the advisor from monio. You remember the word like admonish, monio, that word monio, monere, monui, monitum, the advisor, the warner. And so when the mint was moved down to the area of San Clemente, it kept the name Moneta. And so we find a fragment of the Severian forma urbis, the design of Rome, with the word moneta on it, which is exactly the same design as our one here. And also inscriptions have been found outside the door of San Clemente of officials of the mint. So we have the goddess Moneta. This is from Palazzo Altem's in Rome. And the word, moneta comes to San Clemente, and it is from this word that we get the word money and monetary. So some people, of course, would say the Irish Dominicans are still making money out of it, but however, that's another story. So this is, it's interesting that we have this word, monio, admonish, and the word money come from the same root. So the building of the mint, the horia, the warehouse, whatever, was filled in the 3rd century, and we get this complex of buildings. We're not quite sure what it was. It certainly had painted plaster. It was some sort of domus, this proposal is, but also we think that this was perhaps the original Domus Ecclesia, the house church, because it doesn't become a basilica until about the year 400. And remember, Jerome has already talked about the Ecclesia Clementis, this house church which was constructed back in 385. So the proposal is that this is an example of a Domus Ecclesia, or a house church, a hall where Christians gathered. We know they existed from the sources, but the actual to find the remains of them is a challenge. And so we hope to study this a bit more, this phase. It's fascinating. And we're finding something else on the north side, which are related to this house, that it was some sort of a great structure. This was turned into the basilica, as I say, about the year 400, and it becomes a classical Christian basilica. Central nave, 2 side aisles, the great windows of the clerestory, the great apse built over the Mitraeum, which is now no longer a temple of Mithras, but perhaps is still accessible. That's one of the mysteries. It's as if they conserved the rooms underneath the high altar. It's not a crypt. There are no relics brought into Rome until when? The 7th century. San Stefano Rotondo, Primo e Feliciano are the first relics brought into the city of Rome. The relics of St. Clement are often the Crimea. According to the story, he was arrested, taken to the Crimea, and tied to an anchor and thrown into the sea. So his relics aren't there. The relics of St. Ignatius of Antioch were only brought back to Rome and put into the church of San Clemente about 637, according to the Martyrology of Rome, on the feast of 17th of December, if I remember rightly. So this is the great basilica. What is peculiar about it, what is different about it, is the facade. What we've got is an open facade. It didn't have doors, it had a line of columns, which indicates anyway that it had an atrium of some sort. It's not leading onto a street, but that there was an atrium outside. This is typical of churches about the year 400 in Rome. San Giovanni Paolo, San Pietro in Vincoli, St. Mary Majors, many of them we think had open facades such as this. It was something that appears and then disappears. You've got then another element, another time in the 6th century, with the building of this great, what would you call it, monumental passageway through the church. The panels of this are now in the upper church. What is it? It seems, looking at the what do you call it, the early description of the liturgy, it's called variously by the architects a solia, which isn't quite correct because the solia is part of the sanctuary, sometimes called a chancel, but Victor Saxer pointed out from the Liber Pontificalis that it's called a ruga. A ruga, the same as the root of the word ru, a passageway going almost from the door of the church right up to the altar itself. From the early description of the liturgy, we have these processions going, solemn processions going into the church. However, these descriptions would date to about the year, 700s, whereas this goes back to the 6th century, 533, as I'll show you in a moment. I believe, to explain it, perhaps we've still got this element in the church. If you're ever in St. Peter's during a solemn ceremony, you'll see there are the wooden barriers right up through the central nave. And it's to allow the processions to take place and to keep the people back, to allow these great processions into the church. We find elements of this ruga also in other churches. Most of them were demolished. We find one, for instance, in San Marco, 313, early 4th century, but built in masonry. A lot of them may have been in wood, but this one is spectacular. So the churches would all have had this element of a great processional route, and we find the remains of them in the pavement of St. John Lateran's, in the holes in the pavement. This ruga, which is interesting to explain how the liturgy, the Pope came into the Secretarium, and then the procession took place up to the centre of the church, and each person had their own place within the processional route. So a panel of this we can find now used in the Schola Cantorum. It's interesting that the Schola Cantorum of the upper church is a great enclosure, and the restoration of Santa Sabina was based on the one in San Clemente because it had been destroyed. And when they restored it in 1930, they restored it according to the plan of San Clemente, but it would never have been like that. It was originally the passageway. But it's so beautiful, and we can see the carving. We see now it's not Italian marble. It's Greek marble, and was made, in fact, in the workshops of Santa Sofia. And we can see when, because it's got the monogram in the center. The Pope at the time was a man called Mercurius, or rather the priest in charge of the church. They still had pagan names, Father Mercury. He was elected Pope, and he said, well, Pope Mercury will never be accepted in Notre Dame. So he changed his name to John II. And this is the monogram here of John II. A beautiful workmanship made in Santa Sofia in the year 533 and brought to Rome and set up as this passageway in the lower church. It's something so beautiful, and it's such a delight to celebrate the liturgy every day within the Schola Cantorum, surrounded by these beautiful panels of the 6th century. In the 6th century, Pope John II was responsible for a number of things, and we see to the north of the church, there's a complex of buildings. You've got this, can I point it there, is the Secretarium with the cross in the center, and the door leading on to the narthex. As I say, we've got this in the descriptions of the early liturgy from the 8th century, but this is 6th century, that the grey walls are older walls going back to the 3rd century, and they utilized these rooms for building the Secretarium or sacristy in this area, and a bathroom, or you say a restroom, is it in America? Yeah, up here. And here's the consignatorium, we guess. This is a sort of a guess. That is the room for confirmation. And above it, this baptistry with a great baptismal font, the 2 columns, a monumental space with an apse that originally had a mosaic. Unfortunately, when this was abandoned in the 11th century, all the marble was stripped from the walls, and all you've got is the building. But there's enough left of the traces that we can make some sort of a reconstruction. This is the room at the moment. What you see is the foundation for the opus sectile, or marble decoration of the baptistry. This building was, I say, used until the 11th century. How do we know? Because we have frescoes, such as this one, which I was there the day it was discovered. I suppose I was one of the discoverers of this beautiful fresco of the 11th century as Our Lady as Queen holding the child Jesus. What a moment to discover this amazing fresco. Afterwards, we've got also the pavement, which is typical of the 6th century. Rome has collapsed. You can no longer buy slabs of marble. What you do is break up marble and make these simple designs. It's like a symbol of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Middle Ages, the 6th century, late 6th century pavement. The frescoes of San Clemente, as I say, are one of the great treasures. They've been studied by a man called John Osborne of Canada, a wonderful art historian. And he has dedicated much of his life to the study of the frescoes of San Clemente. There is now a girl doing her doctorate, Claudia Gianfrilli, who has produced, I just saw the first draft of her doctorate dissertation, and it's absolutely wonderful. She's a student of Sereno Romana, who's probably the great art historian who's put together the corpus of medieval painting of Rome, and extraordinary student. And these are just traces that we have of these frescoes that go back to the 6th century. These copies were made during the actual excavation way back in 1800s, and very little survives of them. But other places, we find that the walls were covered in fresco. Originally, the walls of the churches, the great basilica, would have been covered in marble, like Santa Sabina, where you've got the inlaid marble still there, or in the baptistry of St. John Lateran's, this beautiful inlaid patterns of marble. After the 6th century, you cannot buy marble, as I say, so the walls are covered in fresco, and you've got these frescoes. One of them, this amazing fresco, dated to the 700s, perhaps under Hadrian I. It became a very popular theme. The oldest example is back in Santa Maria Antica, but then it becomes a popular theme. What's her name? Mary Stroll was talking about power and influence, says it was there to show that the Pope was obedient first to the Lord and Mary, the Mother of God, and secondly to the Emperor. But this is produced in a time when Rome became almost a Byzantine city. You got such mosaics as Sant'Agnese fuori muri, these extraordinary mosaics that are not narrative, but they're about presence. They're places of prayer. This beautiful, you come before this to pray. And Our Lady, rather like Theodora in the mosaics of Ravenna, but she's represented as an empress with this headdress made of pearls, this beautiful representation. Beside it, Beside it, you've got this fresco which Claudia began her studies on this. And she said to me just 2 weeks ago, she believes it's the oldest representation of the general judgment which has survived in Rome. The general judgment, which becomes a great theme later on, leading to the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo, the great general judgment. And likewise here, we have the saved up here, rather like the saints in Santa Prassede. And it's about the same period, at the 9th century. And over here, we have this scary, scary picture of the devil, not represented in human form, because they believed, the fathers of the church, that the human form was made in the image of God. So they represented the devil as this monster in blue, and you have the fallen beside them. So these are just fragments, really, of what was a great fresco of the general judgment on the north wall. Why was it on the north wall? Well, perhaps because the area of the baptistry gradually became a cemetery. Remember, they began to bury within the walls of the city after the 6th century. So another fresco from the 9th century is this beautiful representation of the ascension of Christ into heaven. Christ surrounded by the angels, underneath is Mary, and underneath the apostles, with just a few colours. They represent the power of their surprise and wonder and fear of the Christ, the Lord, leaving them. Underneath is Mary. And because perhaps at the center there was a relic, and underneath there was an altar. What's interesting is the use of blue. We can see in this figure here, and perhaps you can make it out, it's written there, Sanctissimus Dominus. The next name? Leo. Pope Leo. Pope Leo, not the 14th, but the 4th. It's extraordinary to see it. Pope Leo IV, who was Pope around 850s. What's a beautiful presentation, and it helps us, of course, the date, the fresco. And what's extraordinary is there's a great discussion on the use of the Egyptian blue, still surviving up to the 9th century. One of the last examples of this great colour, which was used back in the Egyptian times, used by the Romans, and finally they can no longer produce the high temperatures necessary to produce the Egyptian blue, and they begin using lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, which was so expensive. So some of the people regard this as one of the last examples of the Egyptian blue. Another scene which is very important is the scene of the burial, the tomb of Saint Cyril. The church today, every day we get pilgrims coming from Eastern Europe. And it's, how can I describe it? He's more important than St. Patrick is for the Irish. That's a way of describing it. Of course, he gave them their language, their Cyrillic from Glagolitic, and he gave them their faith, and he gave them a sense of identity. So they come in great numbers. One of the great experiences of my life was to accompany Pope John Paul II down to pray at the tomb in the lower church of St. Clemente. It was the time of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and he was praying, and he just knelt down in prayer and cried out, asking the intervention of St. Cyril to protect the lands of Eastern Europe when it seemed there could be a world war at that time of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And it was just, I was there himself and Father Leonard Boyle, prefect of the Vatican Library. We prayed, and he prayed, and we prayed together at the tomb of St. Cyril. John Osborne has now identified this as the tomb of St. Cyril, with this scene here of the square nimbus, and it corresponds exactly with the description which we get from Methodius and from the 12th century of the tomb of St. Cyril, buried on the right-hand side of the high altar in a marble sarcophagus with his portrait over the tomb. And this is, there is the icon, if you like, the picture of St. Cyril, and a reconstruction by Guido Baldi of what the arcosolium, or this kind of tomb, would have looked like in the time when it was made. The next picture we got are the series of 11th century paintings, and this is St. Clement celebrating Mass in his church. And a powerful picture with the background scene of the church, the lighting system, the lamps between the columns, the altar without candles, just the chalice, the paten, and the book open at the words, "The peace of the Lord be with you all." And the story of Theodora, who became a Christian, opposed by the husband. The husband was struck blind, and he was brought home. Clement cured him, and he ordered the slaves to take Clement prisoner. The slaves come running, and they tie up a column that's lying on the ground. But the importance of this scene is that it's in every school in Rome or in Italy, because it is written no longer in Latin, but in Italian. It's written in the language of the people. You see, up to this period, all the writing is in Latin. Ego bene de rapizia cum Maria uxor mea per amore Dei et beati Clementis. Because in Western Europe, there's only two written languages. They are Latin and Irish. Was the only other written language in Western Europe. Just I have to mention that. I have to get that in. Irish was written down from the 4th century. We have documents from the 6th. So this was written, and it's, as I say, in every school, because it's an example of early written Italian. However, the guidebooks said this inscription, for its grossness, does not bear translation. Because what happens is, he's saying, come behind and use a lever. He's saying, Alberti, try. And the last scene, Sicinius calls out to the slaves, and he says, Fili delle putti, traite. You sons of whores, will you get it out of here? So this shocked the people, and they didn't like to translate this scene, the earliest example. There was an article last year about the earliest example of bad language in Italian is to be found in San Clemente. This is a miracle. We don't have time to go into this, but this is particularly beautiful because this scene of holding the child that has been found, the lost child, is something which is almost like the world of the Renaissance. And it's coming to the tomb of St. Clement, beside the city of Kherson, where the war is at the moment between, of course, Russia and Ukraine. It's so sad to see it. We come back, the lower church was abandoned in the 12th century. The last thing that happens in the lower church is that it was used for the conclave, for the election of Pope Paschal II. So it wasn't destroyed by the Normans, as everybody says. They held the conclave there. And under Paschal II, the upper church was built. We don't have time to look at all the different details of the dating, but the great crown of San Clemente is the mosaic. The mosaic, which shows the church, the cross of Christ planted into the world. And from the base of Christ, from his blood, comes out this vine which spreads throughout the universe. And the inscription tells us, let us liken the church of Christ unto a vine which Christ made green again. And it touches all the scenes of daily life. It's like a vision of the 12th century. Women feeding chickens, men looking after sheep and goats, the doctors of the church. And up here you've got even the Roman gods, now reduced to harmless devils, all being brought up to the vault of heaven. It's an extraordinary scene. Chesterton wrote a commentary on it. Pope Benedict XVI wrote a most beautiful commentary on the cross, Jesus on the cross, whose head has fallen to one side. He has given up his spirit into the hands of the Father. And yet the scene depicts death. It is a scene of glory and peace. It's a wonderful meditation by Pope Benedict XVI. One of the scenes in it, we've got the doctors of the church. One of them has a red halo. Stefano Riccione is the great man who was a great expert in recent years on the commentary on the mosaic of San Clemente. And Stefano believes that we've got this doctor of the church with the red halo because he is the author of the theme. St. Ambrose wrote a commentary in called the Hexamenon, which is a commentary in the first days of creation. And Stefano says, so he talks about the tree of life being planted in the world and bringing life to renewed life to all creation. So this is an interesting theory anyway, that the work of St. Ambrose is in fact the inspiration for the making of this great mosaic. You've got other scenes. This scene I love, the scene of the deer that runs looking for running streams. This is used by, I remember Seamus Heaney, the poet, came once and he said he loves this poem, this particular scene, and he used it for his Christmas card and wrote a poem on that deer, which is so beautiful from the 12th century. And then we have other strange scenes of this, the owl looking out at us all, challenging us almost. Other scenes that we get from the church are, of course, the pavement. The pavement, famous Dorothy Glass raised the question, was this pavement completely redone? Is it really 12th century? Well, there was a conference during the summer. Andrea Parebeni produced some very interesting copies of the mosaic floor, which were done in the early 1700s, which are exactly the same as they are today. So certainly the designs of the central part of the nave would go back at least to the beginning of the 18th century. So it's a discussion. To what extent were they restored? The other prominent feature, or maybe it's a bit overlooked, is the tabernacle made under the school of Arnalfo di Cambio. It is a fascinating scene. It was made by the nephew of Boniface VIII. And we see here Boniface VIII presenting his nephew to Our Lady and the Child Jesus. But do you notice anything strange about it? Look at Boniface. He's got a halo and he's still alive. And this is exactly the accusation of Philip the Fair of France, that Boniface is making a saint of himself. And he's possibly informed about this. This is made in 1299. He was informed of this because in 1302, Charles of Valois, the pretender to the Emperor of Constantinople, was living where? In San Clemente. The French army of Philip comes down to Anagni, and there's under the colonna, the Pope is given the schiaffo di Anagni. He's beaten across the face. I think much worse happened to him because he comes back to Rome and dies soon afterwards. But Boniface VIII was the one, of course, who introduced the Jubilee year in 1300. So I wonder, was that small, centimetre-high halo partly responsible for the death of Boniface? So it's one of the intriguing features of San Clemente. Another wonderful place is this chapel of Marcellino di Panicale, painted in 1430 when the Pope returned from France. And you've got these two scenes, the Annunciation. Some of the colours have changed, but you have the Annunciation and the death of Christ. The beginning of the life of Jesus when he's conceived in the womb of the Virgin Mary, and the death of Jesus on the cross. The beginning and the end, all of which happened on the 25th of March, according to the story. But they're often juxtaposed in this beautiful way, and the scenes within the chapel themselves are so beautiful in colour and also perspective, that you're looking into the scenes for the first time. It's revolutionary. You've got these scenes which are often overlooked from 1475, about the time of Michelangelo was born. And here the cardinal is being presented into the presence of the Virgin Mary. And you can see by St. Peter, Peter is pushing the cardinal into the presence. And the scene beside it, Mary's looking outward, but look at the child Jesus, looking with such tenderness at the cardinal. It's so beautiful. This is the chapel which was painted in 1600. It was built in 1600. And it's such a joyful chapel, but was in a very bad state. This is what it looks like in the last couple of months. It's been restored beautifully. And see the angels playing music and dancing in the sky. It's a wonderful vision of the faith, really, in this chapel of the Holy Rosary. The painting over the chapel is Sebastian Conca. Another chapel which is being done at the moment is the chapel of John the Baptist. This is the state of the paintings until we got a group to start the restoration. We've been asking the government, we've been asking people, but finally we have an organization called Hortus, a foundation here in America, who's come and helped us to restore the paintings. And this is the result in the last couple of weeks. This is God the Father. You can see how, in the best restoration method, using watercolors and examining, getting back to the original. This is another scene that was there up to a couple of months ago, and this is what it's like today. This angel. It's wonderful what can be done. We have the finest restorers. And it's a curious angel with earrings. It's a little bit foreshortened because it's meant to be seen from below. So they're working on the vaulting, which is made of ceramics. The only one in Rome. Very unusual. Also, what was done in 1725 was the great ceiling and the paintings. We've got these paintings which look so wonderful from below, but once you get up close, you can see the state where all the painting is cracked. So we've got a wonderful team. Here is one of the frescoes being restored, the condemnation of Ignatius of Antioch. Very curious. You've got Trajan condemning Antioch, or Ignatius. And Trajan is pointing to the pagan gods. Ignatius points to the sky. But beside Trajan, can you see him from this angle? Beside Trajan, you've got a man wearing glasses. Is he a time traveler? I don't know what he's doing there, but there's a man wearing glasses. A lovely scene that I love is a farewell to Polycarp in Smyrna, or Izmir we call it today. This is the farewell of Ignatius, bound in chains, to face death in the Colosseum. Another scene which is so badly destroyed, but I hope is being worked on at the very moment while we're talking here, and it's the scene of Domitilla. You can see that the memory of Domitilla continues in the Basilica of San Clemente, even up to, and there were inscriptions of Domitilla up to this period in 1725. These are the workers working away on the ceiling, putting in these wonderful, skilled, mostly girls. They're doing the carpentry, putting in these slivers of wood to fill in the cracks and painting over and restoring the gold leaf. And the last thing is the chapel of Cyril. Remember, the great relics that are contained within the church are Ignatius of Antioch and Clement of Rome, the first two fathers of the church. The relics of St. Clement were brought back by St. Cyril, who died in Rome, and he is buried in this chapel of St. Cyril. So it's a great place of pilgrimage, as I mentioned earlier, of people from Eastern Europe. And what you've got is these scenes made in 1880, which have their own charm. It shows Cyril pleading before the Pope to be allowed have the liturgy in the Slav language. And the final, as I say, that is the final scene. Just to say that San Clemente is one of the great wonders. If you're in Rome, do come, because it's something where you can travel, you can see the tradition of faith in these buildings going back to the 1st century right up to our own time. It is a living tradition, which we can see how generations express their faith in painting, sculpture, mosaic floor, in the structure, in the architecture, in so many different ways. It's a very, very special place. And so thank you for your attention.
Did he leave anything out? So nice to see nice things in Rome, isn't it? Nice, beautiful things in Rome. Honored to have you, Father. That was great. The priest in charge of the archaeology and restoration of San Clemente. So we have a short respondent from another Roman from a foreign country who lives in Rome, not an Irish person, but some other country. Elizabeth Lev holds degrees in the history of art from the University of Chicago and the University of Bologna, and has been teaching art history at the University of Mary's Rome program since 2022. She also teaches for the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, as well as St. Vincent's College. Lev is a well-known Rome and Vatican tour guide, and she has lectured on the art of Rome all over the world. She writes regularly for numerous outlets, such as First Things, Sacerdoce, and Inside the Vatican. And her first 4 books include, and I've read them all, they're all good, The Tigress of Forli, which is an autobiography, Roman Pilgrimage, which is the best book on all the churches of Rome during Lent, and with that theologian guy, and A Body for Glory, and her latest, The Silent Night, A History of St. Joseph as Depicted in Art. Lev has presented a TED Talk on the unheard story of the Sistine Chapel. I think she lives there, actually, and has appeared on many television and radio interviews, from ABC's Nightline to the Today Show. She was featured in the series Museum Secrets for History Television, Brad Meltzer's Decoded, and was the host of Catholic Canvas, a 10-part television series on the art of the Vatican Museums, which aired on EWTN. Please welcome Liz Lev.
There's really not a lot to add after that really, really beautiful and extraordinary presentation, except for the one thing that you're missing is that you're seeing it virtually. There are 3 points. I'm just going to make 3 very short points about San Clemente that I think are really sort of an antidote to several ills of our age. And number 1 is just the sheer experience of going to San Clemente. I find it very, very meaningful in a world where things become increasingly virtual, where people are used to seeing things on screen. Why can't I just read about it? Why can't I just look at it? But particularly, I mean, thinking about this descending those spaces. I mean, even as Father showed that first flight of stairs, when you walk down a flight of stairs and you say, you know, we've just stepped back 1,600 years. And it really does help to understand this idea of these original spaces that people occupied. But for me, one of the greatest lessons that I can impart is to go down to that Mithraeum. Now, I have been going to that church for many years before COVID and all these new exciting rules we had about group size. So I've been down there with a group of 50, with another group of 50, with another group of 50, with another group of 50, and I never thought there's an excellent way to understand a little something about the early Christian church. And as Father Lawler said, he pointed out that, you know, the Mithraism seems to have been very popular. There are thousands of them all over Europe. There are hundreds of them in the city of Rome. And yet it seems to be a religion that had traction. Sometimes they like to think of it was like the competitor of Christianity. But as you heard, it wasn't going anywhere because you had to be a man and you had to buy a bull. But the exclusiveness of the Mithraic religion, which we can read about and we can talk about and we can joke about, But when you go down to a Mithraic cult cell, which is a very small space, the largest one that was ever excavated is excavated in Rome, Bazzicar Cala, what, holds 60 people? I think it's about the same size as the smallest church in Rome, which is San Carlino. And so you walk into this tiny space, and if you're lucky to be where there are another two groups of 50 trying to get around that little space to see the dining room, you realize how exclusive this oh so important religion was. And then you take a short few steps upstairs and you walk into this church that's built in the 4th century. The first spate of early Christian church building, the first calling card of here we are, we're on the scene, and there's room for everybody. So it's one of those sort of physical experiences, and if Duncan knows of what I speak, when you're designing churches, when you're thinking about a sacred space, to experience the sacred space tells you a lot about the faith that informs it. So again, in one hand, in our world that has become increasingly virtual, to be in those spaces, to feel the difference, it really does help us to understand more than just in a cerebral way, but actually in a physical way. The second thing I wanted to bring up is, as an art historian, I can't help it, it's the most amazing place in the world. Because all those things that I try to teach in a survey class about how, first art did this, and then it did that, and then it did this, and then it did that, it's all there in one building. And again, speaking of antidotes of modern ills, I know I see several of my former students in the room who every single one of them have that same deep hatred of me because I give you all those dates to memorize. They said, yeah. You're laughing. They're like, all those nights I couldn't go out and drink because I had your quiz and I was afraid I was going to forget the date. So this idea of historicity, this idea of understanding that there is a passage of time. Like, I understand that God's time is a whole different thing and he does what he does. But our time, I'm afraid it actually does have a progression to it. And what is so amazing in San Clemente is that you can see that progression through art. And obviously for an art historian, that's like pretty cool. So you start with these very early Maria Regina images that are extremely hierarchical. As a matter of fact, I have been going to San Clemente long enough to have watched the date of that Maria Regina image go from 5th century up to 7th century. It's moved right every time. I was like, I wonder what they're dating it today. And so there's been this, but what the reason is that you have an image that is very hierarchical. It's a very sort of fixed image of Mary as queen. This idea of Mary, queen of heaven, something that we're promoting already in the construction of St. Mary Major, this idea of the God-bearer, right? And in a world that is very used to a court, this idea of representing Mary as something that looks like a princess, we see this beginning of the history of art. Then you start to see, as you move into the 900s, some of those beautiful, beautiful images that Father was showing. I really suddenly just wanted to get on a plane, go back to Rome, and go to, hey, I'll see you there on Monday. And see these incredibly remarkable images of, showing Christ, and next to the tomb of St. Cyril, there you've got Jesus like stepping on a little demon. So we have a change that's happening in art. An attempt to tell stories. So the Christians, we're trying to hand on this idea of Mary as the mother of God and Christ is God and he's God and man. And then as we move later on, we begin to develop a desire to tell our story, to hand down the tradition of not only the stories of our salvation, but the stories of the exceptional men and women who have been witnesses to this. And we watch in the history of art, and it must have been amazing in that space for the artist to kind of look at what the other guys did before. Okay, well, I see what they were doing in 500. Let's see, what can we do now in 700? Hey, what should we do now in 900? And then those amazing 1070 images, the ones right before they're going to have to shut down the church. Those images where you not only have the first Italian, which I have to admit is really funny, shows that the Roman vocabulary has not changed much in 1,000 years. And but more to the point, in that second image that you saw, the miracle of the boy, here is an artist, an unnamed artist, attempting to show you a miracle that involves the salvation of a child under the Black Sea, in which the mother is going to find the son after the child's been protected by Clement underneath the Black Sea. I mean, it's an incredibly complicated story. The sea parts, they go to mass, the mom forgets the child, the sea closes, the mom says, Clement, help me, and then a year later, the sea parts, there's the bishop and everybody gets stuck over in the corner, there's the mom, there's the son. So again, there are two elements that are happening that are a sign that the Renaissance must come. One is that poor artist trying to show underwater without perspective. Like, just good luck with that. And yet he tries. What an amazing thing. The bubble, the fish, the black. I mean, you've got someone who's really trying to show. You see that it has to happen, a way to tell these stories. And as you heard, that emphasis on the mother, that emphasis on the human reactions. The mother finds the child, the mother embraces the child. That idea of what humans do, how humans feel, beginning to take center stage long before them Florentines and Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. No offense, Florentines. It's just, we do like to claim things for Rome from time to time. And the fact is that there's this sense of growth that finally culminates when you see that Masolino chapel. And there they are. What does it mean when one-point linear perspective makes its way to Rome? And you can see the stories of Catherine of Alexandria, and she's preaching to the philosophers, and then you look out the window, and she's talking to the philosophers while they're being burned, and you go outside, and she's being imprisoned. So much has developed in one space. And then you go down a few steps further, and there's the Baroque. And no longer are you looking at the wall, but you got angels flying around your head and the ceiling in sotto in su. So again, as an art historian, this is a remarkable, remarkable place, because we get to see the condensing of art history and Christian storytelling, and moving our eye first from this static hierarchical image to the narrative image, to finally this amazing heavenly image all in one space. And then the last thing I just wanted to point out that is really remarkable and wonderful about San Clemente in particular is this presentation, is a little reminder of the commitment of the Catholic Church to its history, to its own understanding of its past, its own understanding of where we come from, our roots, our early communities, our manifestations of ourselves. This whole adventure of Christian archaeology starts in 1600, and they're a little bit earlier, in 1600, in the middle of the Protestant Reformation. In the middle of, is it this, is it that, who's this, who's right, who's got this? Suddenly a man named Antonio Bosio hears about some workers who've fallen in a hole out in some field and found some painting. And there they goes to begin to explore these underground sites, to dig up the history of this Christian past, helped, aided, abetted, financed by the Oratorians. So this beautiful relationship between the church and these scientists of the archaeologists. Antonio Bosio becomes the Christopher Columbus of the catacombs, as we call him. And then even, I'm not going to take up your time with this and that, but I do want you to be aware of the fact that when it comes to Egyptology, when it comes to all kinds of archaeology, there is the Catholic Church fascinated by the past of the Egyptians, fascinated by the past of out digging in Iran, fascinated by these different manifestations of the ancient cultures, of all manifestations of mankind. But in particular, and I'm going to close on this point, in particular in the person of these really remarkable people who within their vocation find a vocation within their vocation to go and dig up this past. So from the Benedictine sisters who were working in archaeology at the catacombs of St. Priscilla to our Father Lawler, it is a really amazing thing, this faith, this church that brings up so much beauty, so much incredible, is able to use so much incredible talent in so many diverse ways. Thank you.
Great. We just have 10 minutes, but we're going to take 15. Any questions? Lawler, do you want to stand there?
Will I stand here, yeah?
Stand there.
Great.
Some questions?
It's all clear.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, great.
Yes. Oh, do you want to do it? you want to just
Yeah.
whoever you pick? Yeah. He's going to do it. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you could clarify how the sort of prominent readings of the first century structure, the domus, fit together. Specifically, I'm wondering if Corelli's reading of that structure as a mint coexists with the idea of that being the house of Titus Flavius Clemens, or if or if I'm getting the chronology wrong more generally.
No. I probably didn't explain properly. You've got the two buildings. One is a domus, which is 3 stories high, as far as we can see, still going up through the various buildings, right up into the garden. You have the first century. So you've got this domus, which has got a cryptoportico, which is slightly underground level, and that's where the Mitraeum was installed. Next door to that, separated by a narrow corridor, you've got another building built in great blocks of tufa and travertine. And it's divided into cells, each with their own entrance onto a central courtyard. And you've got the outer perimeter wall, which is a security wall. There's no trace of decoration, no marble. Even a barracks would have marble decoration. There's no decoration, so it's a horia. It's sort of building we find very often in Ostia Antica, where they stored rooms, people could rent out a room. But we've got because they found the inscriptions at the entrance of the officials of the mint, and also the plan corresponds exactly with a famous plan of Septimus Severus called the Forum Urbis. It's identified as the mint. Maybe it's wrong, but it looks very like it. You know, we know the mint was in that area. We've got these regional catalogues which refer to it. So you've got the two buildings. One is the domus, which is built in brick, right, and divided up into several rooms with mosaic floor, decoration, like Pompeii. And you've got the other building without any decoration, which is an industrial character. The mint was probably on the upper floor, and these were storerooms underneath. I don't know if I answered. Okay. There you go.
No, just ask some more questions. Come on.
Yeah, it's probably the third. Go ahead.
What kind of sculpture has survived as part of the history of this church?
Where are you? Oh, there you are. Sorry. What kind of
Sculptures? And we heard a lot about the development of the art on the walls and in the ceilings.
Surely.
So what about sculpture?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, beginning with the Mitraeum, you've got the altar, this great altar of Mithras, and then you've got various pieces of carved marble, and you've got a terrible thing. It touches me. There was the head of Apollo there until the 1980s, and it was stolen. And it was showed Apollo represented as the sun, because the mythology of Mithras was that Mithras was born from the rock. He entered a cave after the killing of a bull. He went into the cave and celebrated a meal with Sol, the sun god, and was brought to heaven. And we had this statue, which I hope one day will turn up. The statue of Apollo. At the back of the cave, you have the statue of Mithras rising from the rock. So that's in the Mitraeum. Other pieces of sculpture, I'm thinking very quickly, you've got a lot of inscriptions, which of course don't come from San Clemente, but during the Middle Ages, you couldn't buy marble. So what they did was they went outside the city walls and grabbed these pieces of marble and used them for the floor of the church. And also they used old sarcophagi. This is after the 6th century. They went out to the cemeteries and took sarcophagi. And there's a beautiful sarcophagus of Phaedra and Hippolytus, the story of the tragic story of Phaedra and Hippolytus. It's so realistic. The hunting scene with the dogs, you'd almost be afraid to go near it. You know, they're so. Then you've got, of course, the 6th century panels, which were made in Constantinople and brought to Rome. So after that, you've got a whole series of things. You've got the Renaissance sculpture of the monuments, of which there are several. But interesting thing that we find, some of the sculpture, Byzantine, which were later used they were probably part of the presbytery They're Carrara marble, but the workmanship is Byzantine. So it shows that there were Byzantine sculptors working in Rome using Italian marble. Eccoci qua.
I've got a question, actually, for both of you. I know you're primarily focused with history and like the development of art through the church, but I was just wondering if you saw like what can be contributed further. Like, can art rival, or not rival, but contribute to the collection of like the church's history with art over the centuries? Like St. Clemente is you see the development of everything in all the chapels of Christian art, but like, can we still contribute on that level?
Good question.
With all the other centuries?
That's a challenging question. I don't know. The great contribution we can make at the moment is to restore what's there, to stop from losing it, because some of the frescoes have disappeared and the ceiling is crumbling down. But what we see is the remnant of the ages of. But we have to remember all the prayer, the music, all that went on in the church within itself, all that art that took place. But for present day, there's very little. There's a chapel of St. John the Baptist, where the tomb of Cardinal Cicognani, which was made in the 1960s. But it doesn't stand very well beside some of the medieval sculpture.
I think if I can get this working. It was on and now it's not. Are you hearing me? Yeah? Okay. So I do think the person that really this should be addressed to is Duncan Stroik here, who is concerned about making spaces for worship in our modern day. And I really think when we think about today, how to talk about past and present, how to, live tradition in space, painting, sculpture doesn't really speak to people as it once did, but architecture, the form of the church, the gathering people together inside the space still does. So I think there's really a great opening for, if you will, a new San Clemente. If we have to be on this planet for another 2,000 years, I think there's room for us to start making a new San Clemente at any time.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Father, could you say something about how did your order specifically come to be associated with the church?
That's a great question. There's a great story that the Queen Mother of England came to visit San Clemente some 40 years ago and said, "Beautiful basilica, but why Irish Dominicans?" The British ambassador replied, "For historical reasons, ma'am." And she said, "Oh, I understand." Yeah, that solves it. That is to say that in Ireland we had 40 churches in the 1500s. In the 1600s, we had no church. We had 3 churches, one in Lisbon, one in Louvain, and San Clemente in Rome. And it was the place where people come to study to be priests and go back to Ireland and work on the mountainside or in the back streets of the towns in little cottages, and worked during the Middle Ages. So San Clemente was the place that they looked back to, that gave them a sense of the great dignity of the church. You had a man preaching, defending his doctorate. It was actually in Sant'Ignazio, before the Pope and the doctors of the church and all these great people. And he defended his doctorate in Latin. And a month later, he was living in a cottage on the mountainside in Ireland. Wow. And speaking Italian, Latin, French, so many languages. And this is why they gave great leadership to the people. The people were so proud of their priests who had been trained in these houses in Rome and come back to Ireland to work among the people. So that's how we came to be in San Clemente. San Clemente was originally a church of the Ambrosian monks who were suppressed in 1600. The church was lying empty, and eventually the Irish Dominicans looked after it for several years, and it was given to the Dominican order. And the Dominican order, when one of the priests went to the chapter and gave out the list of martyrs, the number of priests who had been killed, and that the churches no longer existed, the Dominican order gave it to the Irish Dominicans in 1677.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Gus. I'm a law student here, and I have a question for any and all who would like to speak on this, which is actually relates to the point you were talking about looking back. There is a ton of history in San Clemente. You see the Black Sea, barbarian raids, great Roman structures, and yet, in my estimation, we have better, more comprehensive historical tools for looking back at the past than we did today, than they did then, as they were designing and building the church. And yet when you go in, it's remarkably cohesive. All the art harmonizes well. It doesn't smash into each piece of art. There's a sense that it all fits together. At the beginning, you talked about how we have this litany of sources about San Clemente. Do we have a sense of what was going on in the intentions of the architects and artists as they were putting the church together over the millennia to ensure that it remained harmonious?
Probably this is better. I just want to say that's why it's so important to study the sources, the literary background, to understand what went on. One of the things that breaks my heart is to see people coming to San Clemente. They go down to the lower church. They think they're going into the catacombs or into a crypt, and they're back up in 10 minutes, and no one has explained to them. So we do need someone to understand what it was like, the description of the liturgy back in the Ordo Romanus Primus in the 8th century, the great procession, the preparation for the liturgy, the absolute description we have of the celebration of the Mass, and related to San Clemente. And to see in the frescoes, particularly the celebration in the 11th century by St. Clement of the Mass, and to understand why it was so absolutely important to the church in 1860 to see these paintings. Remember, a lot of people were saying that the history of the church was made up of legends and myths, that these were all things that were made up. There was nothing true. Giovanni Battista de Rossi said, I have found the tombs of the popes, when he found one inscription, Nelius, which he interpreted as Cornelius, martyr, the pope who was pope in the year 250. And he went to Pope Pius IX, and Pope Pius IX said, you're dreaming, de Rossi. And then he bought the land. And de Rossi excavated and found the tombs of the popes going back to the year 200, the frescoes. And he went there in tears. So he said, it's all true. This is the confirmation that the history of the church that we learned is true. And de Rossi said, no, Holy Father, you're dreaming. He was a brave man to say that to Pius IX. But it was vitally important, that discovery of the catacombs, to understand the background. But the background is necessary, and we have to have, and this is something we're discussing every day, how to transmit that sense of the celebration of the Mass. What was the background of the people who made these paintings, Beno della Pizza, we see the authors with the different levels. To understand that background is essential.
I would just add one thing, just because it seems to me that what really makes it cohesive is not an architect, a designer, a series of managers or site managers. It is actually the traditions that keep that church cohesive. So they never stop thinking about Clement, even though he was Pope in 100. They never stop thinking about him in that church. Ignatius of Antioch, Domitilla, Cyril, they're constantly remembered. And bringing forth those stories, bringing forth that tradition is what, no matter how the manifestations may change according to the style or the medium or the dramatic vicissitudes that the church itself experiences, what drives it through with this incredible coherency is indeed its adherence to tradition as the years go on and on.
Tell me.
Thank you so much for this remarkable lecture. Concerning the liturgical use of the two structures, of the two churches, the one that is, of course, below the wonderful basilica that we all have, do we know, was there at any point where they used together simultaneously? And what was then the motivation? That's to say, the lower
church is
the lower
abandoned.
church and the upper church. Was there at any point where they at any point used together, if you
No.
will? Oh, okay.
No, what happened in the 12th century, the end of the 11th century, the lower church was filled in with rubble because the ground level was rising. It was now dark, damp, damaged by probably Robert Guiscard and the Normans, and it's filled into the tops of the columns. And they cut off the frescoes and put in the pavement. So the lower church actually goes out of memory. It was used for a while, and this is something we're only beginning to discover. Parts of it were used as burial crypts. So when Father Maluli broke into the lower church, he was able to, there was an empty space. The lower church had been forgotten, its existence, after the 12th century. But he got into a crypt and he saw the columns in situ and said, I've discovered the original Basilica of San Clemente. So they weren't used at the same time.
Given the fact that you said, like, at the beginning, their usual reaction is either to, like, bless yourself or to take a picture, and especially given how the church beautifully demonstrates the passage of history, how do you think we can incorporate that into modern architecture? Because it seems like over the past 60 years, that idea of a building visually depicting history has kind of been lost.
Yes, maybe our architect. Go ahead. You go ahead and say.
Your brogue is much nicer.
I have no brogue. It's all relative. Yeah, it's just San Clemente is so astonishing. You're confronted with this wonderful mosaic, the Baroque ceiling in gold leaf, actual gold leaf, the line of the columns, the frescoes. It just leaves a strong reaction, something so beautiful. You're just overwhelmed by it. The colors are so beautiful. And it's going to be even more beautiful after the restoration. At the moment, the paint is peeling off the walls. The ceiling is in very bad state. If you come up and close look at the frescoes, they're cracked and damaged by water. I remember when I went first to San Clemente way back in the 70s, when it rained, the water came through and there was large puddles of water in the middle of the church. So the government did restore the roof. So you got this great work done on the roof, but we couldn't get them to work on the frescoes and so on. They said there are more urgent things to be done. So it is a wonderful example. But I think some of the churches being built today are so wonderful also. I was in a church in New York there, near the Bronx, Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And it's a round church with these glorious stained glass windows full of light and so beautiful, and a wonderful life of the church. I said, oh my gosh, there is hope for the future.
I think I'm jet lagged, so I may be off, but I think we have Mass in 22 minutes, so we need to.
Thank you, Liz, for timekeeper. And thank you all for coming, and let's give a round of applause.